The fog came first. It rolled down from the Book Hills in the pre-dawn darkness of September 9th, 1552, thick and cold as a burial shroud, pooling in the valley below the castle of Eger like water filling a stone bowl. The sentinels on the northern wall had been awake since midnight, not because their captain ordered it, though he had, but because none of them could sleep. They could hear the Ottoman camp before they could see it. Tens of thousands of men breathing, moving, preparing in the darkness below. The sound was unlike anything a human throat could produce alone. It was the low, continuous hum of an army so vast it seemed to vibrate the earth itself, a sound somewhere between a storm front and a living thing. Then the fog thinned and they saw. From the walls of Eger's castle, perched on its limestone hill above the sleeping town, the Hungarian sentinels looked down upon a sight that should have broken every one of them on the spot. The Ottoman encampment stretched from the southern valley floor to the eastern ridgeline, covering ground that had been open farmland just 4 days ago. Wheat fields, orchards, a mill beside a creek. All of it now consumed beneath a city of tents, cook fires, artillery emplacements, and men. Thousands of fires burned in the darkness, tens of thousands. The valley glittered like a shattered mirror reflecting the stars, except these stars did not move, and they did not comfort, and each one of them represented a man who had come here to tear these walls down, stone by stone. Like a jeweled serpent coiled around a hill, the Ottoman host encircled Eger completely. There was no gap, there was no road out. There was nothing beyond those walls now except the enemy. And beyond the enemy, a kingdom that had already given up on the men standing watch. The numbers, understood plainly, were a sentence of death. Inside the castle walls, approximately 2,100 defenders, soldiers, farmers, tradesmen, and some 4 dozen women who had climbed the hill with their husbands and brothers and had no intention of leaving. 6 large cannon, a dozen smaller ones, enough food for weeks if rationed carefully, enough courage, their commander had made certain of that, to last longer than food. Outside, 35,000 to 40,000 Ottoman soldiers, the combined forces of the empire's finest field armies, equipped with 16 of the largest siege cannon ever cast. 150 additional artillery pieces, 2,000 camels loaded with timber for siege platforms, and the absolute institutional confidence of the most powerful military machine on earth. The ratio was 17-1, on a good day for the defenders. But the numbers only tell you what should have happened. They do not tell you what did. Consider what Eger meant in the autumn of 1552. To the north lay Kassa, present-day Košice in Slovakia, the heart of Hungary's silver and gold mining district, the treasury that kept the Habsburg defence of Central Europe financially alive. Lose Eger, lose Kassa. Lose Kassa, and the Ottoman Empire gains not just territory, but the economic engine of its enemy. To the west, the road to Vienna opened like a wound. The Ottomans had tried twice to take Vienna. In 1529, they had come within sight of its towers before logistics and autumn weather turned them back. Eger was the way station, the logistical anchor, the fortress that made a third attempt viable. And beyond Vienna, beyond the calculations of generals and sultans and Habsburg emperors, lay the question of whether Christian Europe would survive the 16th century with any meaningful power intact. All of that rested on a limestone hill, on 2,000 people who had no reinforcements coming. 39 days, 12,000 cannonballs, and a handful of lions who refused to die. To understand what happened at Eger, you have to understand what Hungary had already lost, and how fast it had lost it. In the summer of 1526, the Kingdom of Hungary was a medieval power in the full flush of late confidence, a nation of considerable military tradition, proud of its cavalry, proud of its border defences, proud of the long line of kings who had held the Ottomans at bay for a century. Then came Mohács. One battle, one afternoon, August 29th, 1526, on a flat plain in southern Hungary, where the Hungarian army, outnumbered and poorly coordinated, met the forces of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and was annihilated in approximately 2 hours. King Louis II, 20 years old, drowned in a stream while trying to flee the battlefield, his horse losing its footing on the muddy bank. The nobility died around him. The army ceased to exist as a coherent force, and with it, so did the Hungary that had existed for 5 centuries. What followed was not a defeat, it was a dismemberment. By 1541, the Ottoman Empire had occupied Buda, the Hungarian capital, the seat of 1,000 years of kings, and turned it into the administrative centre of a new Ottoman province. Hungary ceased to be a kingdom in any meaningful geographic sense. Instead, it became 3 fractured pieces of what a kingdom used to be. The central lowlands, the great flat heart of the country, the richest agricultural land, the most populous regions, fell entirely under Ottoman control, administered by Ottoman pashas, taxed by Ottoman collectors, patrolled by Ottoman Sipahi cavalry. The eastern region, Transylvania, became a semi-autonomous principality, technically ruled by a Hungarian noble family, the Zápolyas, but backed, installed and directed by Ottoman patronage. And the narrow crescent of northern and western territory that remained, the mountains, the mining towns, the border fortresses, that became Royal Hungary, nominally governed by the Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand I, who had inherited the Hungarian crown through marriage and dynastic accident, and who now found himself responsible for defending a country he had never fully understood against an empire he had never fully respected. Ferdinand was not a bad man. He was simply an overwhelmed one. He ruled the Habsburg domains from Vienna, juggling the Protestant Reformation tearing apart Germany, the perpetual financial crisis of maintaining armies across half of Europe, and the Ottoman threat pressing from the southeast, all simultaneously, with revenues that were never quite sufficient and advisors who disagreed about everything. Hungary to Ferdinand was simultaneously essential and impossible. Essential because losing it meant the Ottomans reached Austria directly. Impossible because defending it required resources he could not spare from a dozen other crises. And so Hungary's border fortresses defended themselves. Or they didn't. The spring and summer of 1552 made the stakes catastrophic and immediate. Sultan Suleiman, now in his 50s, still formidable, still the dominant political and military figure of the age, did not lead this campaign personally. He had learned, over decades of warfare, to delegate. What he dispatched instead was something arguably more terrifying than his own presence. 2 of his best field commanders, operating on converging axes designed to strip Royal Hungary of its fortress network in a single season. From the east came Kara Ahmed Pasha, the second vizier of the empire, a man of considerable bureaucratic skill and military experience who had spent his career executing the Sultan's will across 3 continents. Ahmed was methodical, patient. He had crushed opposition before and seen fortresses fall that everyone thought would hold. He brought with him the largest siege train yet assembled in a Hungarian campaign, The Zarbuzan alone, those monstrous bronze cannon capable of throwing stone balls the size of a man's torso, required 50 soldiers each to move and position. Ahmed had 16 of them. He did not lack for confidence, and he had every reason not to. From the north and west came Hadim Ali Pasha, operating out of Buda, the Ottoman-occupied Hungarian capital, pressing toward the fortress towns of the northern bend of the Danube. His campaign was swift and brutal. Vesprem fell. Bujac fell. Dregeli fell. Its small garrison fighting to the last man in a defense so fierce the Ottoman commander reportedly ordered a proper burial for the Hungarian captain out of respect. One after another, the border castles collapsed or were abandoned, their garrisons too small, their Habsburg reinforcements too slow, their defenders too aware that help was not coming. Then, in July, Temeshvar fell. Temeshvar was different from the others. It was a major fortress, a genuinely significant military installation with a genuine garrison, commanded by a genuinely brave man. István Losonczy, a Hungarian nobleman who understood clearly that he was holding a position no one else wanted to hold. Losonczy resisted for 40 days. His men died on the walls and in the tunnels and in the streets of the lower town, as Ottoman forces pushed through sector by sector. When the fortress finally fell, Losonczy attempted to lead his surviving men out under terms of surrender, terms Ahmed Pasha had agreed to. But somewhere in the chaos of the capitulation, Ottoman soldiers cut Losonczy down as he walked out the gate. Whether it was deliberate policy or undisciplined soldiers in a blood frenzy, the result was the same. The man who had held Temeshvar for 40 days did not survive the morning after he stopped fighting. His death sent a message through every remaining Hungarian garrison in the region. Hold out and die. Surrender and also die. The mathematics of resistance were being rewritten in the worst possible direction. Then, in August, came what may have been the most demoralizing event of the entire campaign. Szolnok, a fortress of genuine strategic importance guarding a key Tisa River crossing, fell in a single day. Not because Ottoman forces were irresistible, not because the walls collapsed under cannon fire, but because the garrison, composed largely of foreign mercenaries who had no particular attachment to the land they were supposed to defend, simply abandoned their posts. They loaded what they could carry, slipped out a back gate before the Ottoman army fully invested the position, and left. The fortress, barely bloodied, handed to an empire that had not even had to fight for it. Two stories from 1552 were thus written into every Hungarian soldier's consciousness before the army even reached Eger. Temeshvar, fight well, die anyway. Szolnok, hire foreigners, watch them run. The contrast was not subtle, and it was not forgotten. It was against this backdrop of catastrophe, fortress after fortress falling, an empire advancing without meaningful resistance, a Habsburg emperor too distant and too preoccupied to intervene, that the combined forces of Ahmed Pasha and Ali Pasha turned their attention north, toward the limestone hill above the town of Eger, toward the castle that stood between them and the silver mines of Kassa, toward the 2,000 people who were already there, already waiting. Their commander was reading a letter. István Dobor held the folded paper without expression, reading Ferdinand's response to his repeated requests for reinforcement. No additional soldiers were coming, no additional cannon, no additional funds for hiring more men or purchasing more powder. The king offered his prayers and his confidence in Dobo's ability to manage the situation. Dobo folded the letter carefully and set it on the table beside him. He looked out the window at the southern valley, already showing the dust clouds of the Ottoman advance. Then he turned to his officers, and his voice, when it came, was completely calm. Not the calm of a man who was not afraid, but the calm of a man who had already made his decision and found it surprisingly simple. "Close the gates," he said, "and make sure every man in this fortress understands there is no road out of here except through victory. Anyone who speaks otherwise will not need a road." He was not a man given to speeches. He was a man given to results. He had taken command of Eger in 1549 and spent 3 years doing exactly what Ferdinand's treasury would not fund: strengthening walls, stockpiling provisions, training a garrison in the specific requirements of fortress defense. He had looked at this hill and understood it. He had looked at the approach routes and understood them. He knew where the walls were weakest, which bastions provided the best fields of fire, how the limestone bedrock would resist Ottoman mining attempts. He had planned for this, not because he expected it, but because a man like Dobo planned for the worst precisely so the worst did not catch him unprepared. "Better a few lions," he said, when asked later how he expected so few men to hold against so many, than many rabbits. It was not a metaphor, it was a policy. The castle of Eger was not, by the standards of 16th century military architecture, a masterpiece of defensive design. Its position on the limestone hill east of town gave it commanding views to the south and west, but left the northern and eastern approaches relatively less exposed to defensive fire, a weakness that any competent besieger would identify within hours of arrival. It was not particularly large. It was not particularly modern. Its walls had been built and rebuilt across several centuries, layered over the ruins of older fortifications that went back, according to local tradition, to the era of the Huns, which was probably exaggeration, but the underlying point was accurate. The bedrock beneath Eger's foundations had been worked by human hands for a very long time, and that accumulated stonework, dense and deeply anchored in the limestone hill, was something no Ottoman miner's pickaxe was going to break through easily. The castle comprised 2 linked sections, an inner and an outer fortress, with a gatehouse tower at the southeastern corner and 6 bastions distributed along the walls. The Dobo bastion anchored the western wall. The Shandor bastion guarded the northern face, the most exposed, the most frequently targeted, the most important. The Boliki bastion covered the northeast corner, where the ground dipped slightly and provided Ottoman approaches with marginally better cover. The Bebek bastion held the eastern edge of the outer fortress, while the Earth bastion and Prison bastion covered the northwest. Between the inner and outer sections, the Church bastion sat like a spine, the last line before the innermost keep. Each bastion was a world unto itself. Each had a commander. Each had its assigned complement of soldiers, its cannon positions, its supply of powder and shot, its emergency reserves of rocks and timber and hot oil. Dobo had spent 3 years making certain that every man in the garrison knew not only his own position, but 2 others, so that casualties could be absorbed without the defense developing gaps. He had war-gamed this siege in his head 100 times. He had walked these walls in every weather, in every light, learning their angles and their dead zones, the way a farmer learns his land. The garrison that Dobo commanded on September 9th numbered approximately 2,100 souls, of whom roughly 1,500 were capable of sustained combat. The rest were support personnel, cooks, stable hands, runners, and the women, whose role in the coming weeks would prove to be something entirely different from what military convention of the era imagined. The professional soldiers were a mix of Hungarian cavalry who had dismounted and taken up wall positions, infantry veterans of previous Ottoman skirmishes along the border, and, crucially, 6 German master gunners whom Dobor had hired at considerable personal expense specifically to operate Eger's artillery with maximum efficiency. 6 Germans among 2,000 Hungarians. It seems like a small thing, but those 6 men understood the mathematics of artillery in ways that would matter enormously when every shot had to count. Eger's cannon inventory was modest: 6 large pieces, a dozen smaller artillery, and approximately 300 trench guns, shoulder-fired weapons that could be deployed along the walls to sweep attacking infantry. Against the Ottoman siege train, this was not a fair fight by any mechanical calculation. Ahmed Zarbuzan could throw balls that would shatter a meter of stone wall with a single impact. Dobor's largest cannon could answer, but not match. The Hungarian advantage lay elsewhere: in position, in preparation, and in one man working in a basement. Gergely Bornemisza was 20-something years old in 1552. The historical record is imprecise on his birth date, more precise on his extraordinary talent for turning ordinary materials into instruments of destruction. He commanded a detachment of 250 Hungarian infantry, which he did competently. But his real contribution to the defense of Eger was happening in the hours when his men slept, in a low-ceilinged storeroom beneath the Dobor bastion that smelled of sulfur and machine oil and something sharper: chemical. The specific scent of a man pushing the boundaries of what a controlled explosion could do. Bornemisza had been working for weeks before the siege began. His lamps burned all night. His notes, scrawled calculations, diagrams, measurements, covered 3 bound notebooks. He was not inventing new principles. He was applying known ones with a creativity that the Ottoman commanders, for all their experience, had never encountered in quite this form. The basic hand grenade existed in his era: a clay pot or iron shell packed with black powder, fitted with a slow fuse. Bornemisza made them smaller, more reliable, and packed them with something extra: oil-soaked rags, fragments of iron, and a pinch of sulfur, arranged so that the initial explosion would scatter flaming fragments rather than simply a pressure wave. The bomb was more ambitious, the size of a barrel, requiring 2 men to carry and deploy. Inside, black powder for the primary charge, surrounded by oil and sulfur, with flintstones positioned so that the explosion would shower the surrounding area, not just with shrapnel, but with sparks that would ignite whatever they touched. Cloth, wood, flesh. The reed mats Ottoman soldiers used to approach walls, all of it would catch. But his masterpiece was the wheel. An old mill wheel, 3 feet across, its wooden spokes hollow. Bornemisza had packed those hollows with the same sulfur and oil mixture, added the powder charge at the hub, and fitted a fuse designed to ignite on impact. The wheel would be rolled from the castle's upper walls down the steep hillside into massed formations of Ottoman infantry climbing toward the breach. It would roll through them, and then it would not stop rolling. It would not simply explode, it would erupt. It would scatter liquid fire in every direction, coating whatever it touched, burning through the gaps in armor that a cannonball could not find. He was not building weapons, one account of the siege noted years later. He was building nightmares. On the night of September 8th, the last full night before the siege began, Dobor made his rounds. He walked the walls alone, by choice, carrying no lamp. He knew the stones well enough to navigate by feel and starlight. The night was clear and cold. the first real chill of early autumn pressing down from the north, and he could see his breath misting ahead of him as he moved from bastion to bastion, checking, listening, watching. In the valley below, the Ottoman camp stretched from horizon to horizon. A second city, larger than Eger itself, glowing with 10,000 fires. The sound of it carried clearly in the cold air, horses moving, men speaking in Turkish and Arabic and Tatar dialects, the creak of wagon wheels, the distant rhythmic drumming of the evening prayer being called across the camp. He stopped at the Sandor bastion and watched a young soldier, perhaps 17, perhaps less, kneeling at the base of the wall with his hands pressed together and his eyes closed, lips moving silently. Dobor did not interrupt. He stood and watched the boy pray for a full minute, then moved on. At the church bastion, a woman, one of the garrison wives who had refused to leave when evacuation was offered, was sharpening a short sword on a whetstone. The sound, a slow, careful, almost meditative rhythm in the darkness. She did not look up when Dobor passed. She had already made her decision. He did not need to confirm it. The garrison women had been offered horses and an escort south before the Ottoman ring closed completely. Most of them had refused. Their reasons varied. Husbands on the walls, nowhere else to go, a stubbornness that matched the limestone beneath their feet. But the effect was unified. 40-some women had chosen to remain, and in choosing to remain, they had chosen to fight. They knew what they would do when the ladders appeared. They had already gathered the cauldrons. Dobor found his deputy, Istvan Mekshi, at the Western Overlook, studying the Ottoman positions with a quality of focused attention that made him look less like a man watching an enemy and more like a man solving a geometry problem. Mekshi was the right kind of deputy. Not a man who agreed with everything, but a man who, once a decision was made, executed it completely. "They'll hit the north wall first," Mekshi said, without preamble. "Ali will," Dobor agreed. "Ahmed will try the east." Simultaneously. Eventually. Dobor looked down at the fires, but not the first day. The first day, they'll want us to see the cannon, to count them, to decide whether we'd like to leave. Mekshi said nothing for a moment. Below, one of the great Zabuzan was being positioned on its timber platform, the barrel catching moonlight. A dark cylinder, 5 feet long and as thick as a man's waist. A piece of engineering that represented months of labor and the full industrial capacity of an empire. "Make sure they eat well tonight," Dobor said quietly. Then he walked on. Below, in the homes around the castle, empty now, their inhabitants fled or climbed to the fortress above. The town of Eger sat silent and dark. In the valley, the Ottoman fires burned. On the hill, 2,000 people lay down for the last quiet night they would know for 39 days. And most of them, if they slept at all, did not dream of victory. They dreamed of home. They dreamed of the faces of people they had loved before the world became this hill, this wall, this night. By morning, everything would be noise. Phase 1. The sky opens. The first Zabuzan fired at dawn. No herald, no final ultimatum. Dobor had received it the evening before and returned the Ottoman messenger without a word, which was answer enough. Just the sound, a detonation so vast that it was less heard than felt. A pressure wave that rolled up the hillside and hit the castle walls like a physical blow, rattling loose mortar in the joints, knocking 2 sentinels off their feet on the Sandor bastion, silencing every bird within half a mile in an instant of shocked quiet before the echo died and the second cannon fired. then the third, then 4 at once, then 6. And the morning broke open around Eger, like something being torn.
Knock and draw.
The smell reached the walls before the smoke cleared from the valley.
For the kingdom.
Black powder, thick and acrid, sulphurous and heavy, mixing with the cold morning air and coating the back of every throat with something that tasted like metal and fear. Stone dust followed, fine as flour, billowing from the first impact point on the northern face, where a Zarbuzan ball, a sphere of marble, carved by hand from quarry stone somewhere in the Balkans, weighing perhaps 60 pounds, had struck the Sandor bastion at chest height and removed approximately a square metre of the facing stone. Clean, surgical, terrifying. "Keep your heads down," Dobor said. He was already moving toward the Sandor bastion, walking, not running. It was important that the garrison see him walking. "Man your positions. Do not show them your faces over the parapet. Stay low and return fire on my signal." The Ottoman artillery plan, visible to any trained eye watching from the walls, was architecturally precise. Ali Pasha, operating his battery from a position on the eastern ridge that gave him an oblique angle across the northern face, had positioned 4 of the largest Zarbuzan to work the Sandor bastion in rotation. One fired, while the crew of the next swabbed the barrel, rammed a fresh charge, and seated the ball. In practice, this meant the northern wall was receiving an impact approximately every 4 minutes. Over the course of a day, a long, cold September day, light from 5 in the morning until 6 at night, that was roughly 200 strikes on the same section of wall. By noon on the first day, the outer facing of the Sandor bastion had been visibly damaged. Chunks of stone the size of a man's head lay scattered at the base of the wall. A crack had appeared in the masonry above the gun embrasure, running diagonal and clean, the way stone cracks when its support is being removed from below. The Hungarian gunners working the bastion had shifted position twice as the parapet above them became unstable. But they had not left. They were firing back, their smaller cannon unable to match the Zarbuzan in destructive power, but perfectly capable of targeting the gun crews below if the Ottoman crews became careless. They did not become careless. They had done this before. What the Ottoman commanders had not fully accounted for was what happened on the Sandor bastion every night. As soon as the light failed, as soon as the artillery fire slackened and the Ottoman camp settled into its evening rhythms, Dobor sent the repair teams. Hungarian soldiers, garrison workers, women, anyone not on watch duty, carrying stone, timber, bags of earth, anything heavy and solid. They worked in near darkness, by feel and by torchlight carefully shielded from Ottoman archers, filling the cracks and shoring the breaches with whatever was at hand. It was not elegant work. The repairs were obvious in daylight. Patchwork, clearly inferior to the original masonry, visible as scars on the face of the bastion. But they held. They held because they had to, and the people making them understood that fully. By the end of the first week, the Sandor bastion was visibly smaller than it had been on September 9th, but it was still standing. The Ottoman bombardment had expected to open a practicable breach, a gap in the wall wide and level enough for infantry to pour through, within 3 days. 3 days passed. The wall stood. 5 days, still standing. 7 days, and still the battered, patched, stubborn face of the Sandor bastion presented itself to Ali Pasha's Zarbuzan each morning like a challenge. But the Ottoman army was patient. It had done this before, and it had other options. Phase 2. The war beneath the ground. By the end of the first week, the Ottoman Engineering Corps had reached a conclusion that any experienced besieger would have reached. Artillery alone was not going to take Eger quickly. The walls absorbed punishment and were repaired at night. The garrison was not breaking. A different approach was needed, one that went not at the walls, but under them. Mining had been a standard siege technique for centuries. The method was straightforward in concept, brutal in execution. Dig a tunnel from behind your own lines, angling down and then horizontally beneath the enemy's foundation walls. Shore the tunnel with timber supports as you advance. Then, when you reach the position beneath the wall, pack the chamber with black powder and ignite it. The resulting explosion would collapse the tunnel, bringing the wall above it down in a cascade of stone. If the chamber was properly positioned and the powder charge correctly calculated, you could open a breach 20 feet wide in a matter of seconds. The problem at Eger was the limestone. The bedrock beneath the castle was not the soft clay and gravel substrate that Ottoman miners had worked in a dozen previous sieges. It was dense, layered limestone, fractured in places by centuries of frost-thaw cycles, but fundamentally hard. The kind of stone that rang like a bell when struck with a pick, and wore out iron tools in hours rather than days. The Ottoman mining teams, experienced and well-equipped, found themselves working 3 times as hard for a third of the progress they expected. Their tunnels advanced in feet per day rather than yards. Inside the castle, Bornemisza's countermine teams were listening. The technique was simple and ancient. Lay the heads of drums face down on the earthen floors of the lowest cellars, and listen to the vibration of the drum skin. Stone transmits sound with remarkable fidelity, and a pick working against limestone 40 feet away produces a vibration distinctive enough, if you know what to listen for, to track direction and approximate distance. Bornemisza's listeners worked in shifts, lying on the cold cellar floors with their ears pressed to the drumskins, mapping the Ottoman tunnel network by sound in the darkness beneath the castle. When the sounds converged, when it became clear that an Ottoman tunnel was approaching a specific point beneath the inner fortress, the Hungarian counter-mining team dug toward it. 2 tunnels meeting in the dark, both sides aware by now that the other was there. Both continuing forward because stopping meant conceding the space. They met sometimes, with swords and knives, in passageways too narrow to swing an axe. Fighting by touch and sound in absolute darkness. Men dying face to face in spaces that 2 people could barely share. It was the most intimate form of violence in an already violent place. None of the mining attempts, Ottoman or Hungarian, succeeded in bringing down a section of wall. The limestone bedrock won every time, absorbing the powder charges and refusing to crack in the directions the miners needed. But the process cost both sides men and time and energy that neither could easily spare. And it added a particular psychological dimension to the siege. The knowledge for the castle defenders that the ground beneath their feet was not entirely trustworthy. That somewhere below the courtyard, below the storerooms and the stables, men were digging. It was during this phase, the second week, when the artillery ground on and the tunnels made their slow progress, and the garrison was beginning to understand the specific exhaustion of sustained siege defence, that Bornemisza deployed his wheel for the first time. An Ottoman infantry column was attempting to advance up the western slope under cover of a heavy bombardment of the Dubo bastion. the intention being to exploit any gap created by artillery with a fast infantry rush before the garrison could plug the breach. They had reached the midpoint of the slope, shields raised against arrow and musket fire from the walls, moving quickly and in reasonable order, when the wheel appeared at the crest. It came over the parapet rim in the early afternoon light, tumbling once as it cleared the edge, and then it found the slope, and it moved. A burning mill wheel 3 feet across, fire already seeping from the hollow spokes, spinning down the hill with gathering speed, directly into the centre of the advancing column. Soldiers scattered. Some ran sideways, some froze. The wheel hit the ground among the middle ranks, and the charge detonated. Not a simple explosion, but a spreading cloud of liquid fire, the sulphur igniting in streams that caught on clothing and leather and the dried grass of the hillside, burning with a blue-orange intensity that clung and spread and would not be smothered by any ordinary means. The column broke. It did not regroup for an hour. From the walls above, the garrison watched, and for the first time since September 9th, there was laughter. Phase 3-5. Assaults. By the third week, both sides had settled into a rhythm that would have seemed grotesque to anyone who had not lived through the previous 14 days. The Ottoman cannon fired from dawn to dusk. The garrison replied when targets presented. At night, the walls were repaired. Before dawn, the cannon began again. Men died on walls and in tunnels and at gun positions, and their comrades worked around them because there was nothing else to do. But the artillery was not enough, and Ahmed Pasha knew it. Eger had not collapsed under 2 weeks of intensive bombardment. The breach on the Sandor bastion, while real and growing, had not yet reached the dimensions needed for a successful infantry assault. And every night, the Hungarian repair teams reduced it marginally, kept it from becoming catastrophic. Ahmed needed direct action. He needed his soldiers on those walls. He ordered the first general assault on September 18th. The Janissaries moved at mid-morning, when the light was full and the defenders would have no darkness for cover. Ladders, carried horizontally by teams of 4, rush parties sprinting behind them, archers suppressing the parapet as the ladder teams crossed the open ground and hit the base of the Sandor bastion. The ladders went up. The first men began to climb. What met them was not what the Ottoman assault planners had modelled. Women appeared on the walls, not as observers, not as support. The garrison women of Eger moved along the parapet with the focused efficiency of people who had thought carefully about this moment and made their preparations. Cauldrons of water brought to a full rolling boil over fires that had been burning since before dawn, carried by pairs of women in heavy gloves, tilted over the parapet edge and poured directly down onto the ladders and the men climbing them. Scalding water then, from different positions, maintained by a second group working further back, rendered animal fat, heated to the point where it moved like water and coated whatever it touched. Into the already burning men below, quicklime, scooped from barrels and thrown in handfuls to create a choking, blinding cloud at the base of the wall. Rocks, sections of broken masonry, anything heavy that could be moved. The Janissaries on the ladders, some of the best trained assault infantry in the world, fell. Some died before they reached the ground. Some survived and crawled back out of range. The ladders, those that had not been pushed clear of the wall entirely, were pulled back as the assault stalled. Ahmed ordered a second assault 3 days later, then a third. Each one reached the walls. None of them breached the walls. The Ottoman commanders adjusted their approach each time, Different targets, different timing, different combinations of artillery suppression and infantry rush. And each time, the garrison adjusted with them. Mexi, his left shoulder already wrapped in linen from a fragment wound, directed the defense of the Sandor bastion through the second assault with his sword arm and his voice, moving reserves to gaps before the gaps fully opened, anticipating Ottoman movements with the instinct of a man who had spent 3 weeks studying how these particular attackers thought. Dobo appeared at the Dobo bastion during the third assault, when a ladder team had managed to get 3 men to the top of the wall before being thrown back. Appeared personally with a group of a dozen soldiers from the castle's last reserve, and stood at the breach point until the ladder was down and the wall was clear. In the Ottoman camp, Ali Pasha watched these failed assaults with growing frustration. He had told Ahmed in private that the Sandor bastion was not ready for infantry, that the breach needed another week of sustained fire before the walls were physically incapable of being defended. Ahmed had overruled him. Ahmed had his own calculus. Time was becoming a factor. Ottoman powder supplies were not unlimited, and the autumn weather, which would ground artillery in mud and rain, was approaching faster than expected. He needed the castle now. The 4th and 5th assaults came in the final days of September, the largest yet. Combined operations with artillery firing until the last possible moment before infantry contact, ladder parties in multiple columns hitting 3 separate points on the wall simultaneously. The 4th assault came within 100 feet of getting men over the western wall of the outer fortress before Bornemissa's bomb teams met it. Barrel-sized charges rolled to the parapet edge and dropped directly into the concentrated mass of men at the ladder bases, each bomb detonating with a gust of liquid fire that scattered the assault formation and bought the defenders the 60 seconds they needed to push the ladders clear. By the end of September, Ahmed's assault teams had reached the walls 5 times. They had not yet taken a single meter of them. Phase 4. The earth shakes. No one knows exactly what caused the explosion. The Ottomans claimed sabotage, an Ottoman infiltrator who had managed somehow to reach the interior of the castle and reach the powder magazine. The Hungarians, in the accounts they recorded afterward, offered no certain explanation. Only that the explosion happened, and that it very nearly ended everything. Bornemissa's records, among the most reliable of the siege documents, suggest it may have been an accident. A spark from a damaged cannon breech landing on a powder train that someone had failed to clean from the magazine floor. What is certain is the magnitude of what happened. 24 metric tons of black powder, stored in the central storage tower of the castle's inner fortress, detonated on the morning of October 4th. The sound was heard in villages 8 miles away. The shockwave crossed the Eger valley in a fraction of a second and hit the Ottoman encampment with sufficient force to knock men off their feet. In the castle itself, the tower ceased to exist as a structure. It became, in approximately 1/10 of a second, a column of fire and stone fragments moving upward at lethal velocity, and then a raining cascade of masonry that fell across the inner courtyard in chunks, ranging from pebble-sized to the size of cartwheels. The ground shook. The inner wall connecting the church bastion to the Sandor bastion developed a visible crack that ran from foundation to parapet. A section of the northern facing of the inner fortress, approximately 12 meters wide and 4 meters tall, buckled outward and came down. For the first time in 25 days, there was a practicable breach in the walls of Eger Castle. In the Ottoman command tent, Kara Ahmed Pasha heard the explosion and was already rising from his chair before the sound finished rolling across the valley. He stepped outside and saw the smoke column, black, massive, climbing into the October sky, and he understood immediately what it meant. He turned to his staff officers. "All forces," he said. Now the drums began. The signal horns sounded. Across the Ottoman encampment, 35,000 men began to move toward the hill. But Dobor was already there, not at a desk, not at a command position in the inner keep. There, at the edge of the collapsed section, standing on a pile of still smoking stone rubble, with his sword drawn and his voice carrying across the chaos of the courtyard like something physical, something that hit people in the chest and stopped their retreat before it had fully started. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. A fragment had found him, and the blood had dried down the left side of his face in a dark line, and he did not appear to notice it. "Fill it," he said. "Everything. Carts, barrels, timber, horses if you have to. Fill it now." They filled it. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary 30 minutes in the entire 39 days of the siege. With Ottoman forces streaming up the hill, the Janissaries in full assault formation, the Sipahi cavalry pressing from the eastern approach, drums driving the pace. The garrison of Eger carried everything they could lift to the breach in the northern wall and piled it there. Carts were driven to the gap and overturned. Barrels of salt, barrels of grain, the food stores they would need for the winter, if there was a winter, were rolled to the gap and stacked. Timber beams from damaged structures inside the castle were dragged by hand to the breach. 2 horses, already wounded and unable to stand, were killed and their carcasses added to the barricade by men who apologized to them as they worked. It was not elegant. It was not stone. It would not survive another direct artillery strike. But it filled the gap. And when the first Ottoman assault column reached the breach, what they found was a wall of debris 8 feet high and 6 feet deep, behind which stood the garrison of Eger in full resistance, having had 30 minutes to compose themselves and pick their ground. The assault was turned back. That night, the longest night of the siege, Dobor organized work parties that did not sleep. By dawn, the breach had been partially closed, with real materials, stone, packed earth, timber framing. It was still weak. It would remain the weakest point in the defense for the remaining 2 weeks of the siege. But it held. Phase 5. The final storm. By mid-October, the arithmetic of the siege had turned ugly for both sides, but in different ways. Inside Eger, approximately 1/3 of the garrison was dead or permanently incapacitated. Men who had lost hands, eyes, limbs to stone fragments and Turkish iron, who would not recover in time to hold a weapon again. The supply situation was manageable, but diminishing. The walls were structurally compromised in 3 locations. Dobor himself had been wounded twice, once in the hand, once in the shoulder, and was operating on something beyond normal human endurance, sustained by the specific force of will that keeps leaders moving when their bodies have already voted for the floor. Mexi could barely stand. The garrison was still fighting, but it was fighting on borrowed time. In the Ottoman camp, the arithmetic was different, but no less grim. Ahmed Pasha had run out of marble cannonballs twice in the course of the siege, a logistical failure that stopped the Zarbuzan bombardment for days at a time, while resupply parties were dispatched to quarrying sites in the surrounding region. Powder supplies were critically low. The early autumn that the Hungarians had noted with relief, cold nights, heavy rains that turned the siege works to mud,
had done equal or greater damage to a camp of 40,000 men living in tents on open ground. Dysentery moved through the Ottoman forces with the same patient efficiency as a slow tide. Rice rations had been reduced. There were reports in the Ottoman command's private communications
of officers diverting supplies for personal profit, the kind of corruption that flourished when an army was frustrated and its leadership distracted. And the leadership was distracted. Ali Pasha and Kara Ahmed Pasha were no longer pretending to have a unified command. Their disagreements, which had been private in September, were visible to their staffs by the second week of October. Ahmed wanted another mass assault. He believed the castle was close to breaking, that one more coordinated push across multiple points would overwhelm the defenders, who could no longer be at full strength. Ali believed the opposite, that another mass assault would cost 10,000 men and not take the castle, because the problem was not the defenders' strength, but the castle's geometry, because the breach had been repaired well enough that there was no clean entry point for the numbers of men Ahmed wanted to commit. Two commanders, two strategies, no consensus. On October 15th, Ahmed ended the argument by issuing orders a 2-day continuous assault, rotating waves of infantry hitting the northern face, the breach point, and the Dobo bastion simultaneously, with no rest intervals that would allow the garrison to recover. He would take Eger by attrition if he could not take it by breach. The assault began before dawn on October 16th. For the men and women inside Eger, it was the worst 36 hours of 39 terrible days. Ottoman infantry pressed the walls from multiple directions simultaneously, not in the coordinated rush of the earlier major assaults, but in a grinding, relentless series of escalating attempts that came one after another, without the breathing space the garrison had learned to rely on. Every breach was contested. Every ladder that went up required someone to push it down. And pushing a ladder full of climbing men away from a wall is not a gentle task. It requires leverage and commitment, and the willingness to stand at a parapet edge while men below you are trying very hard to kill you. Bornemissza committed his remaining wheel bombs in the first hours of October 16th, sending them one after another down the northern and western slopes into the concentrations of Ottoman ladder parties, buying minutes at a time, each one less effective than the last, as the Ottoman soldiers adapted to what they were seeing and left wider gaps in their formations to let the burning wheels pass harmlessly between them. His last one deployed at mid-afternoon of the first day, and when it had gone, he had nothing left but swords and muskets, and the same desperate arithmetic as everyone else. But by the morning of October 17th, the second day of the continuous assault, something was changing in the Ottoman camp. The waves came less frequently. The drum tempo faltered. 3 separate assault columns that had started up the hillside in good order turned back before reaching the walls, without apparent cause, not repulsed by fire from above, but simply stopping, reversing, returning to the camp with a quality that the garrison watching from the walls recognized, though they could not have named it precisely. It was the quality of men who had decided. In the Ottoman command tent, Ali Pasha said the thing he had been not saying for 2 days. "We cannot take it." Ahmed did not respond for a long time. He sat at the camp table, maps spread across it, papers, quills, the administrative detritus of a campaign, and looked at the castle on its hill, which was smaller than it had been 6 weeks ago, damaged in ways that would take years to properly repair, manned by a garrison that had lost a third of its people, and was almost certainly in the process of losing more, and which was still, undeniably and infuriatingly, standing. "Prepare the order," Ahmed said finally. On the morning of October 18th, 1552, the Ottoman camp began to disassemble itself. The Zabuzan were lifted from their platforms, loaded onto their transport frames, hitched to the lines of oxen that would pull them back south along the road they had come up 6 weeks before. The tents came down. The supply wagons were loaded. The great Ottoman host, 35,000 men and their equipment, their camp followers, their horses and their camels, and their marble cannonballs, turned and began the long march away from Eger. The castle watched them go from the walls. No one moved for a long time after the last Ottoman column disappeared around the bend of the road. No cheering, no celebration. Just the garrison of Eger standing on their damaged walls in the October cold, watching the valley empty of an army that should have taken them in 3 days, staring at the ground below, littered with the evidence of 39 days of human fury, with abandoned equipment and the mounded earth of hasty Ottoman graves and the scattered marble balls that had missed their mark, and trying to understand what had just happened. Then someone began to cry, and then, slowly, the walls of Eger Castle filled with the sound of people who had been holding their breath for 39 days, finally, at last, allowed to breathe. The silence after an army leaves is its own particular quality. Eger had not been quiet since September 8th, not for a single hour of a single day. For 39 days, the soundscape of the castle had been defined by cannon and drum and screaming and the specific percussion of stone on stone that becomes, after enough repetition, almost indistinguishable from background noise. Now the valley was simply still. Birds were already returning to the fields below, cautious and quick, picking through the disturbed earth of the Ottoman encampment with the pragmatic interest of creatures who understand that where armies have camped, food can be found. Dobu stood on the Shandor bastion, the most damaged, the most contested, the most repaired bastion in the fortress, and looked south along the empty road. His face was unreadable. He had not slept in 2 days, and possibly not properly in 2 weeks. And the specific exhaustion of that was visible in the set of his jaw and the way he held his wounded shoulder, slightly forward, slightly braced, as if bracing against something that was no longer there. Behind him, the castle told its own story in stone and silence. The damage was comprehensive and visible. The Shandor bastion's northern face had been reduced in some places to barely 3 feet of wall, patched and repatched with rubble and timber, until it resembled less a military installation than a desperate improvisation in stone. The tower that had held 24 tons of black powder was simply gone. A cleared space, a foundation edge, a scorch mark on the earth, the shape of a flower blooming outward. The inner wall, connecting the church bastion to the northern face, bore a crack that would require years of professional masonry to properly address, if it could be addressed at all. Everywhere, the pocked stone, the shattered embrasures, the places where the wall surface had been scoured clean by repeated impact, until the underlying limestone showed bare and pale as exposed bone. Inside those walls, approximately 12,000 Ottoman cannonballs had landed. The number, recorded by chroniclers and confirmed by excavations in subsequent decades, remains almost incomprehensible. 300 rounds per day, an average, sustained over nearly 6 weeks. Defenders had learned, by the second week, to read the sound of a Zarbuzan firing from specific positions and predict the approximate impact point well enough to step aside. The garrison had developed, by the end, the particular dark humor of people who have lived too long under bombardment. They had named some of the more regular Ottoman cannon, given the Zarbuzan nicknames based on their trajectories and the sounds they made. The human cost was both smaller and larger than expected. Of the approximately 2,100 people who had entered Castle Eger on September 9th, roughly 400 to 600 were dead. The range reflects the difficulty of separating battlefield deaths from those who survived the siege only to die of wounds in the days and weeks that followed. Perhaps another 200 were permanently maimed, hands gone, eyes gone, the kind of wounds that the 16th century's medicine could keep a man alive from, but could not repair. Jobo had lost both of his personal squires, the young men whose job was to stay beside him in combat, and who had, staying beside him in combat, paid the price that proximity to a commander under sustained fire requires. Mekche recovered from his wounds over the following months, though he would carry the shoulder injury for the rest of his life. A permanent reminder, encoded in cartilage and calcium, of the morning in late September when he had continued directing a defence with his sword arm, while a fragment of Ottoman cannonball worked its way through the muscles of the other. The Ottoman losses were not precisely recorded. The empire had less incentive to document its failures. But contemporary estimates and subsequent historical analysis suggest between 8,000 and 10,000 dead over the course of the siege. Buried in the haste of an army pulling out, in the mounded earth around the former camp, in the Ottoman field hospitals that had been working without pause for 6 weeks. Ahmed Pasha returned to Constantinople to find that the Sultan's congratulations on the broader campaign of 1552, which had, after all, taken dozens of fortresses across Hungary, were considerably cooled by the specific failure at Eger. Ahmed retained his position, but lost the political momentum that a clean victory would have provided. Ali Pasha, whose tactical judgment had been consistently sounder than his superiors throughout the siege, received neither punishment nor reward commensurate with his actual contribution. He had been right about almost everything. He had been overruled at almost every key decision. He returned to Buda and continued his work, his vindication unacknowledged, his name recorded in the subsequent histories not as the man who nearly took Eger, but as the man who had, by his own admission, not taken it. In the days immediately following the Ottoman withdrawal, Ferdinand I issued formal recognition of Dobo's achievement. Land grants, the title of Voivode of Transylvania, the gratitude of a monarch who had offered none of the material support that might have made the gratitude less necessary. The royal recognition was genuine, and the rewards substantial, and Dobo accepted them, and then, in a gesture that cut to the center of who he was, he resigned. He and his senior officers submitted their resignations collectively. The stated reason was Ferdinand's failure to provide any meaningful assistance during the siege. The underlying reason was the same. A man who had just held a castle against 40,000 soldiers with no support from his king had earned the right to say clearly what he thought of that king's conduct. And resignation was a form of speech that could not be easily dismissed. It was the act of men who had proved something and knew they had proved it, and who would not pretend otherwise for the sake of diplomatic convenience. The castle command passed to Gergely Bornemisza. He would hold it for several years, and he would improve its defences. The lessons of 39 days encoded in every improvement, every added bastion, every reinforced gate. He would be recognized in Hungarian culture as a hero of the siege, the inventor of the fire weapons that had broken assault after assault. And then, on a road somewhere in Hungary, he would be ambushed by an Ottoman patrol, captured, and, without ceremony or negotiation, hanged. The man who had built nightmares for the enemy died in the manner of a common prisoner. History has a particular cruelty for its most inventive characters. What Eger proved, immediately and practically, was that the Ottoman advance into northern Hungary was not inevitable. In the autumn of 1552, this was not a small thing. The campaign of that year had been, by any objective measure, an Ottoman triumph. Temesvar gone, Szolnok gone, Veszprém gone, Lipa gone. 25 smaller fortifications erased from the map in a single season. The northern approach to Vienna had been stripped of much of its defensive depth. On the ledger of territories and fortresses, the empire had gained enormously. But Eger was a ledger entry that could not be quantified in square kilometers. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that the fortress system could, under the right conditions, work. That a properly commanded, properly motivated garrison could absorb 40,000 soldiers and 39 days of industrial-scale bombardment and still be standing at the end. Ferdinand took the lessons seriously in ways he had not before the siege. Habsburg investment in the remaining northern Hungarian fortress network increased substantially in 1553 and the years following. Engineers were dispatched, upgrades commissioned, garrisons reinforced. The specific weaknesses exposed at Eger, insufficient powder storage away from the main walls, bastions that lacked adequate depth to absorb prolonged artillery, were studied and addressed. The Ottoman advance into Thrace and the Balkans had proceeded in part because the defences they encountered were static, outdated and under-resourced. Eger was, for the Habsburg military administration, a case study in what adequate preparation could accomplish, even without reinforcement. The silver mines at Kassa continued operating. The revenue continued flowing. The northern Hungarian financial infrastructure, which would have been Ottoman property within weeks of Eger's fall, remained in Habsburg hands for another generation. In the long accounting of the Ottoman-Habsburg struggle for Central Europe, the survival of that revenue stream represents a consequence that compounds over decades, invisible in any single year, but enormous in aggregate. And yet, the longer view is complicated by what happened 44 years later. In 1596, the Ottoman Empire tried Eger again. This time, Sultan Mehmed III came in person, a sultan commanding his own campaign, with all the prestige and resources that implied. The garrison facing him numbered 7,000, more than 3 times the defenders of 1552, better equipped, defending walls that had been improved by decades of post-siege investment. But 7,000 of the wrong kind. Foreign mercenaries, hired soldiers from across Europe who had come to Hungary for pay rather than for the land. Men who had no particular reason to die for a limestone hill in a country that was not theirs. They held for 12 days. Then they surrendered. The comparison was not lost on Hungarian observers at the time, or on the historians who came after. 2,000 people with a reason to fight held for 39 days. 7,000 people without one held for 12. The arithmetic of motivation is not precise, but its direction is consistent. Eger remained in Ottoman hands for 91 years, until 1687, when the long Habsburg reconquest of Hungary finally swept through and returned the city to European Christian control. The castle Dobor had defended was, by then, Ottoman architecture layered over Hungarian foundations. The physical record of 9 decades of occupation visible in the building materials and the construction styles. History written in limestone and minaret, as much as in any text. What the siege became in the memory of Hungary was something beyond a military event. The earliest formal record was made by Sebastian Tinodi Lantos, a travelling musician and chronicler who was in the region shortly after the siege and interviewed survivors, possibly including some of the defenders themselves, before composing the account in verse and music in 1554. His chronicle is imprecise in places and vivid in others, the work of a man writing from living memory rather than archival distance, and it became the foundation on which every subsequent version of the story was built. 2.5 centuries later, the story found its most enduring form. Géza Gardonyi's novel, Egri Csillagok, published in 1899, translated into English as Eclipse of the Crescent Moon, wove the historical record of Dobor and Bornemisza and the garrison women into a narrative that became, almost immediately, one of the defining texts of Hungarian national identity. School children read it. Films were made from it. The 1968 film adaptation still airs on Hungarian television with the comfortable regularity of a national ritual. A country returning to its own story the way a river returns to its bed. Bertalan Székely's painting, Az Egri Nők, the women of Eger, their figures arrayed along a burning parapet, pouring fire on the enemy below, hangs in the Hungarian National Gallery in Budapest. A piece of the 19th century's romantic vision of the 16th century that nonetheless captures something true. That the defence of Eger was not a military operation in the conventional sense. Not soldiers executing a commander's strategy in a clean chain of command, but a community in extremis. Every category of person drawn into the fight by the specific gravity of a place that mattered to them. That is what made Eger different from Szolnok. That is what made it different from Temesvár, where a brave man fought and died without being able to transmit his courage to the mercenaries around him. The difference was not tactical. It was not strategic. It was not even ultimately about Dobor's genius as a commander, though that was real and it mattered. The difference was that the people inside Eger had decided, each of them individually and then collectively, that this hill was theirs. That the ground beneath their feet was worth more than the ground they could reach by leaving. Dobor had said it best, without meaning to say anything philosophical at all, better a few lions than many rabbits. He meant it as a practical observation about the quality of men he wanted in a fight. But it became, in the telling and the retelling, a statement about something larger. About the difference between people who are in a place and people who belong to one. About what happens when an empire built on professional violence meets a community built on something it cannot easily name and cannot easily extinguish. The Ottoman Empire was, by any measure, the greater force at Eger. It had the cannon and the soldiers and the experience and the institutional confidence of an organization that had absorbed every army it had faced for 100 years. It had everything that military power is supposed to require. And it left having gained nothing, because the 2,000 people on the hill had something the Zarbuzan could not reach. The specific conviction that leaving was not something they were willing to do. Centuries later, the walls of Eger still stand on that hill. The castle is a museum now.
Tourists walk the bastions where Mekche directed his defence, stand at the Shandor bastion's northern face and look out over a valley that is peaceful and green and crossed by roads that carry cars rather than armies. In the walls and in the earth of the old courtyard, the excavations of the 20th century found what the siege left behind: iron fragments, charred wood, and the marble cannonballs, hundreds of them, still buried in the stone that swallowed 39 days of fury and refused to give it back.
The castle absorbed them. It held them. It still does.